The silent ones. The sky was the color of old bruises, purple and dark. When Mason arrived in Hollow Creek, the town sat in a valley, surrounded by dense forests that stretched for miles in every direction. It was the kind of place that had been forgotten by time, a small dot on the map where everyone knew everyone else's business, and secrets never stayed hidden for long. Mason had come here looking for peace, a break from the chaos of the city. He had rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, a simple place with a creaky porch and a view of the trees. It wasn't much, but it was exactly what he needed, or at least, that's what he thought. The first few days were uneventful. Mason spent his time hiking through the woods, enjoying the solitude and the fresh air. The people in town were friendly enough, though they eyed him with curiosity whenever he passed by. He didn't mind. He wasn't here to make friends. He just wanted to clear his head and escape from the noise of his life for a while. But something felt off about Hollow Creek. It wasn't something Mason could put his finger on right away, just a subtle sense that things weren't quite right. The way the townspeople spoke in hushed voices when they thought no one was listening. The way they glanced nervously over their shoulders, as if expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. Then there were the nights. They were too quiet, unnaturally so. Even deep in the forest, Mason expected to hear the usual sounds of nature, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant hoot of an owl, maybe even the howl of a coyote. But there was nothing, just an eerie silence that pressed down on him like a weight. It wasn't until his fourth night in the cabin that things started to get strange. Mason was sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool evening air, when he noticed movement in the trees. At first, he thought it was an animal, a deer, or maybe a raccoon, but as he watched, he realized it was something else entirely. A figure stepped out from the shadows of the forest. It was tall and thin, its body draped in tattered black robes that fluttered in the breeze. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but Mason could feel its eyes on him, watching from the darkness. For a moment, he was frozen with fear. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Was it some kind of prank? A trick of the light? But no, it was real. He could feel it, deep in his gut. The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity, unmoving, just watching. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared back into the trees. Mason sat there for a long time after that, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to do. Should he go into town and tell someone? But who would believe him? And besides, what exactly had he seen? A ghost? A spirit? It sounded ridiculous, even to him. Eventually, he convinced himself it had just been his imagination. Maybe he was tired. Maybe the isolation was getting to him. He decided to go to bed and forget about it. But the next night, it happened again. This time, there were more of them. 3 figures, standing at the edge of the trees, watching him with those same hidden eyes. Mason could feel their gaze, cold and penetrating, as if they were looking right through him. He tried to move, to run, but his legs felt like lead. All he could do was sit there, paralyzed by fear. And then, just like before, they vanished. Mason barely slept that night. He lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the silence that had once felt so peaceful, but now seemed menacing. His mind was filled with questions. Who were they? What did they want? Why were they watching him? The next morning, he decided to go into town and ask around. Maybe someone else had seen them. Maybe there was a logical explanation for all of this. He walked into the small diner at the center of town, the one place where everyone seemed to gather. As soon as he stepped inside, the conversations died down, and all eyes turned toward him. Morning, Mason said, trying to sound casual as he took a seat at the counter. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and tired eyes, approached him with a forced smile. What can I get you? Just coffee, Mason replied. He hesitated for a moment before leaning in slightly and lowering his voice. I wanted to ask you something. Have you ever seen anything strange in the woods? Like people? Figures? The woman's smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. I'm not sure what you mean, she said, her tone stiff. Mason frowned. Come on, you must know what I'm talking about. I've seen them. Last night, and the night before that. They were standing at the edge of the forest, just watching. At that, the woman's expression changed. Her eyes darted to the other patrons, and Mason could see the fear in her face. She leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper. You need to leave, she said. Get out of here while you still can. Mason blinked in surprise. What are you talking about? They're not people, the woman continued. glancing nervously over her shoulder. They're not human. They're the silent ones. They've been here for as long as anyone can remember, watching, waiting. No one knows where they came from, and no one who's ever gotten too close to them has come back. You need to leave before it's too late. Mason stared at her, his mind racing. But what do they want? Why are they here? The woman shook her head. No one knows, she whispered. But once they've marked you, there's no escaping them. Before Mason could ask any more questions, the woman turned and hurried away, leaving him sitting there, stunned and confused. He left the diner and wandered through the town, trying to process what he had just heard. The silent ones. What did that even mean? And why were they watching him? He spent the rest of the day in a haze, his thoughts racing, trying to come up with some sort of plan. Part of him wanted to believe that the woman was just crazy, that there was a rational explanation for all of this. But another part of him, the part that had seen those figures in the woods, knew that there was something more to it. As night fell, Mason found himself back at the cabin, dreading what might happen next. He tried to stay awake, to keep himself busy, but exhaustion eventually took over, and he drifted off into a restless sleep. He awoke to the sound of whispering. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but as Mason lay there, he realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was voices, low, eerie voices, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. His heart raced as he sat up in bed, his eyes scanning the room. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were coming from all around him. Then he saw them. The silent ones were standing outside his window, their hollow eyes fixed on him. There were more of them now, dozens, maybe even hundreds, their black robes fluttering in the night air. They were closer this time, just outside the glass, their whispers filling the air like a chorus of the damned. Mason scrambled out of bed, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was trapped, frozen in place, as the silent ones pressed closer and closer. Then, without warning, the window shattered, and the figures surged into the room. Mason screamed as they descended on him, their cold, skeletal hands wrapping around his arms, his legs, his throat. He fought against them, but it was like fighting against shadows. They dragged him out of the cabin, into the woods, their whispers growing louder and louder until they were all he could hear. As they pulled him deeper into the forest, Mason's vision began to blur. The world around him became a haze of darkness and cold, and the last thing he saw before everything went black was the hollow, empty eyes of the silent one staring down at him. When Mason didn't show up in town the next morning, no one said a word. They had all known it was only a matter of time. The silent ones always took what they wanted, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. The cabin sat empty for months, slowly falling into disrepair. The townspeople avoided it, just as they avoided the woods. They knew better than to go looking for Mason. He was gone, just like all the others before him, and somewhere deep in the forest, the silent ones watched and waited, their hollow eyes always searching for their next victim. The end was inevitable. In Hollow Creek, it always was.